a colleague of mine at work who was a co-author in the book that we wrote, was talking to me one day at AUT and said to me, I want to talk to you about the whole low carb thing. I'm like, oh God, not you. And I was still trying to process, and I was trying to make it go away, because it was just against everything that I'd ever, learned and believed, and was teaching students. And he said to me, this is Professor Grant Schofield, he says to me, so Caryn, tell me, type 2 diabetes, people with type 2 diabetes have got, type 2 diabetes is characterized by insulin resistance, isn't it? Yeah, it is. And at the time we had just picked up a PhD student who was looking at hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, Dr. Casman Crofts. Anyway, so he was exploring this science and saying to me, so type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance is a connection. Yep. So insulin resistance is kind of when you're, there's an excess of insulin in the body, and it's kind of doing the same job to blood sugar, but it's distributing blood sugar around the body, but it's doing it at a higher level. And you could say that the body is kind of intolerant to carbohydrate, because the body's got to work much harder to clear the carbohydrates from the system. I'm going, yeah. What are you getting at? What's the point? Now, so then, how come the dietitians prescribe a high carbohydrate diet for people with type 2 diabetes if this is the very thing that they're having problems with processing around their body? And that kind of was like it literally punched me in the stomach. I'm like, oh, there must be a good reason. Let me go and find out. And of course I came up with, well, there's, you need your healthy whole grains, you need your vitamins and minerals and your fiber and your everything, from your food groups. And then I thought, no, so there's something not quite right here. And when it all came out that the whole, food group distribution was largely an exercise around a table by a bunch of people many years ago, looking at the RDIs or RDAs from America, recommended daily intakes of nutrients, they went, okay, so the RDI of say vitamin B1 is whatever, where are we going to get that from? Oh, whole grains. So it was just like an exercise that covered all the food groups, rather than saying you need all your nutrients, your micronutrients, you can get them from wherever you want, provided you get them and provided you get enough fiber. Does it really matter if it's from lots of carbohydrate or a little carbohydrate? So it was at that time where my whole kind of philosophies and thinking pattern changed, and this was sort of November, December, and I went away for my Christmas holiday thinking, I think I've got to get out of the profession, because this is literally too much for me. Like, I didn't know what to do with myself. And then I came back, I just tried it out myself, came back, and then started to do this in my practice, and felt pretty anxious. The first client that I had that told them to reduce carbohydrate and to have full fat milk, and then then you get great outcomes, and you realize that this is actually good, it's safe, it's whatever. So that was the transition. So it's about 8-9 years ago that I got into the space, and to be fair, I don't work in the ketogenic space a lot. I work in the low carb space. So ketogenic, absolutely, for people with certain cancers, particularly brain cancer, concussion, migraine, epilepsy, for sure. And for those people who want to be more extreme and can sustain that longer term, that's fine. And also for athletes at various cycles of their kind of their training strategies and whatever. So you'd go ketogenic for certain periods of time. But for most of my clients, I work in the low carb space, because I find that you can achieve a lot in the low carb space, great outcomes, and it tends to be more achievable long term.
That is such a great point. And I certainly have made the mistake of throwing that term around a lot in this interview. And we do it
Mhm.
all the time. We
Mm.
confuse keto with ketosis. We confuse keto with the ketogenic diet, or what the ketogenic diet even is, and with low carb. And it's all in the space of, low carb. I love Dr. Fetke did the same thing in the introduction, where it said low carbohydrate, healthy fat. It's not high
Mm.
fat. The
Mm.
way we first said, it's healthy fats, including those healthy
Absolutely.
fats. But we don't do, I don't think we do a great job distinguishing the different levels. So can you explain a little bit more about the difference between low carb versus ketogenic versus even something like a carnivore or no carb diet?
Yeah, so I guess we'll start with sort of standard, say, American guidelines or New Zealand Ministry of Health guidelines, where your carbohydrate requirements are between 45 and 65% of your total energy. And that typically can work out to be 250 grams plus. And that's what's kind of recommended. We'll go to the one extreme of the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is where you take your carbohydrates to below sort of 20 or 30 grams of net carbs per day. That is very, very low. And typically, if you want to, if you're doing very, very strict keto, say for epilepsy, your fat percentage is going to be up at like 80%. And that what that will do is put you in a state of nutritional ketosis. So it will mean that not only is your body using fat as a fuel, but also your brain is now switching from a glucose fuel source to a ketone fuel source. And of course, when ketones are used by the brain, there is you do get cognitive benefit from that, and that is one of the reasons why the ketogenic diet therapeutically is so good for conditions where fuel utilization in the brain is kind of, there's a question mark around it, right? So something is happening with glucose fuel utilization, and actually by switching to fat or ketone utilization, there's an improvement. Nowadays, even for epilepsy, you can do a more modified, they call it a modified Atkins, where you keep the carbs as low, but the fat doesn't necessarily have to be as high, but you still achieve nutritional ketosis. So you've got the one extreme and the other extreme, and then in the middle, in the gray middle, there's that kind of moderately low and low carb space. Typically, everyone's got their own kind of definition. The one sort of definition that's come from the literature from Richard Feynman is under 130 grams of carbohydrate per day. That is considered a low carb diet. Some people say, again, in the literature, when you look at the studies, anything under 45% of total energy is considered low carb, but that could still be, like
That could
200.
still be a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't work with percentages typically with my clients. I sit in that space. Depending on what their goal is. I might say if someone is type 2 diabetic, and they've got a family, and they've got lots of stuff going on in their life, and they're not one of these people who just wants to go keto, I would say, try and sit between the 50 and 75 or 50 and 80 grams per day. It's still really low, and
Yeah.
you might sort of go in and out of a mild level of ketosis, but that's absolutely fine. And as long as the person is achieving their goal in terms of improving their blood sugar control and losing weight, if they need to lose some weight, then why do they have to go as extreme as keto? I don't know. I find that I get a lot of clients come and see me, and they go, I've been on the keto diet before, and it really worked for me. And then I'd say, well, then what are you doing talking to me here? What's it, and they go, oh, it's just a bit extreme. And I did it really well. It was really awesome for like a month or two. And then I fell off. They just don't know how to moderate.
Yeah.
So that low carb space, I think, is really good. I mean, with any approach that you go on, you've got to watch the creep. You've really got to watch the creep. You've got to watch the creep in everything, even people who are strict.
Yeah.
Having a check-in with themselves or people or others, health professionals, is really a good idea for people who can't necessarily, get it under control themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you've got carnivore, which is interesting. So that's like close to no carbohydrate, depending on how you define it. And again, carnivore some people just say it's meat and meat products. Other people say, well, actually it's dairy as well. And then other people say, well, you know, once you've sort of done what you need to do, you can sort of bring a little bit of vegetables here and there. It's like, well, that's not the carnivore diet. That's like the modified carnivore diet. So I think everything's kind of creeping. And I really think that people need to find what works for them, whether it's, you know, different proportions of meat and vegetables. I don't know. All I know is that a whole food approach, choosing foods that are minimally processed, is the most important thing. Protein is incredibly important, and particularly for, you know, over the age of 40, protein becomes more important for, you know, for athletes, for adolescents. Protein is really important. And carbohydrate is about, you know, keeping it in a spectrum where you need to put it depending on your goal, and looking at the best quality carbohydrate. And I think if you've got that covered and you really pay attention to nutrient density, then, you know, that's the battle won.
I mean, I've heard you talk about this in the past where it's like if you're going for those whole foods, you are probably going to be in that low carbohydrate space anyway. You'd have to like really try hard, almost like eating tons of fruit, which even then would be tough because there's so much fiber and things filling you up, that it would be really challenging to be above about 150 grams a day.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely, because there is that whole, you know, if you just eat whole food, well, like, what is the definition of whole food? Well, that's another kind of open up a can of worms. It's, you know, is yogurt whole food? Because it is still minimally processed. Well, I mean, I consider it whole food, but then other people wouldn't. You can't really go out into a forest and catch a yogurt, you know. So there is an element of of totally, you know, unprocessed and then minimally processed that gets included in the brief. Everyone makes up their own rules, but whole grain bread is not whole food, because it's made in a factory. And I think when you go from making stuff in your kitchen to making stuff in a factory, the food quality and the level of processing is different. Then becomes a different thing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So for me personally, I prefer to stay more on the strict side, although it's interesting. I consider myself being on the carnivore diet for the last 3.5 years or so. But when you're saying the level of carbohydrate to be in deep ketosis, 20 to 30 grams, I'm probably exceeding that. I mean, I use condiments from time to time. I drink coffee. Sometimes I'll have a beer. Like those things like that isn't necessarily carnivore. And that's probably more than 30 grams of carbohydrate for sure. But
Yep.
but I love the approach that you take where it's like you don't need to be this strict. You can get really good results, include some carbohydrates in the diet, and just adjust accordingly based on your needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just getting back to your point there, I do think people who are well adapted, and, you know, fat adaptation is this thing that happens over time. We don't know the exact day that it takes place. But we know that some people who are, you know, metabolically well regulated, have been in ketosis, adapted, you know, have had those mitochondrial adaptations for a very long time, can actually get away with staying in ketosis on a higher level of carbohydrate at times. So it's not a one size fits all.